flap or gear configuration changes. Anyway, at 20 minutes past 4 in the morning, the crew decided to go for their second approach. They asked for the latest weather from the controller, who gave them the wind of 230 degrees, 14 meters per second, gusting 18, visibility 6 kilometers with scattered clouds at 630 meters, which is almost 2,100 feet, and no reported wind shear on the runway. Wind shear was still forecasted, but since there had been no reports during the preceding 30 minutes, the controller didn't report it. The crew requested descent, and as they started getting vectors for the approach, they again discussed the speed additive, and this time they correctly identified it at the maximum, 20 knots. Their reference speed was now 133 knots, since their weight had reduced to 54 tons after having burned off so much fuel in the hold, meaning that they would fly a final speed of 153 knots. These discussions and calculations were sharp and accurate, showing that there were no signs of fatigue present, at least not at this point. They were now directed to change over to the next controller, who cleared them to descend, first to flight level 60 and then to 600 meters on the QNH 908. When he heard this, the captain picked up that they had flown the last approach on the incorrect QNH of 990, again showing that he was on the ball here. He slowed the aircraft down and asked for flaps 1, and at this point both the autopilot and autothrottle was still engaged. The conditions were very similar to the first approach, with moderate turbulence and initially flown completely inside of clouds with no outside visual references at all. Flaps 5 was now selected as the crew was given a report from a departing aircraft which had just experienced some light icing, but there were no indications that their aircraft was feeling any icing effects at all. The controller told them to turn to a heading of 270 degrees, and on that heading they were again cleared for the ILS runway 22. At time 04:36 and 5 seconds, the aircraft intercepted the ILS localizer and started tracking it towards the runway. They were then at a distance of 11.5 nautical miles, or 21.3 kilometers away, and at an altitude of 2,250 feet. The first officer asked for a wind check and was told that it was still 230 degrees at 12 meters per second, gusting 18, which was similar to what they were expecting, and they also received an updated QNH figure, which they set on their altimeters, and they were then told to contact Rostov Tower. When they signed in, the tower welcomed them back, gave them the same wind as they had just received, and cleared them to land runway 22. Up until this point, everything was perfectly normal and in very similar fashion as in the previous approach. They started descending down towards the runway following the glide slope, and as they did that, they also extended the gear, selected flaps 15 and then set the missed approach altitude to 8,000 feet. As they descended to 2,165 feet, the captain again disconnected the automatics, probably for very similar reasons as the previous approach. He called for flaps 25 to be selected, and a few seconds later flaps 30, and then the first officer started challenging the landing checklist. When the aircraft descended to 1,000 feet, they were almost completely stabilized, on path and with the speed just slightly high at 163 knots, reducing towards 153. The captain called out, stabilizing now, as he tried to get the speed back towards the fly speed, but he was also about 0.3 dots high above the glide slope, so he had to push a bit forward, and this was also combined with a slight increase in thrust from 65 to 70%. That thrust was significantly higher than what would be considered normal for a 54-ton aircraft on final with flaps 30, even on this slightly shallower approach, and that could have been a sign for what is about to come. As the captain was doing these corrections, he likely also had the runway in sight, given the visibility and height of the cloud cover, so it is reasonable to believe that he was quite landing-minded at this point. But now, the poor weather again made itself known in the form of a strong positive gust of wind. This, in combination with a slight forward pitch and the high thrust, made the speed trend reverse directions, and instead of reducing, it now increased with 15 knots within just a few seconds. This meant that the speed was now suddenly 176 knots, 1 knot above the maximum for flaps 30, and if you remember, this type of sudden speed change actually qualifies as a wind shear indication. The first officer called out, "Check the speed," and when the captain looked down, he saw the rapid speed increase and decided to immediately go around. Now, things will start happening very quickly. At time 04, 40 and 50 seconds, the toga switches were pressed and the thrust levers again moved fully forward into the mechanical stops. The captain only said, okay, go around, and never mentioned wind shear, but since he gave full thrust, it's pretty fair to assume that this was the procedure that he was now planning to fly. But since there had been no warnings and wind shear had not been mentioned, the first officer likely thought that the captain was doing a normal go-around. So he asked if he wanted flaps 15. The captain responded, flaps 15, and here something started to happen. Most likely, the captain had been fully concentrated on the landing up until this point, and then, in his mind, he had switched over to the wind shear escape maneuver. But now he had started changing the configuration, which was part of another procedure that he hadn't mentally planned for, with the engines roaring at full thrust, again pushing the nose upwards. He had lost the initiative, and he was now quickly starting to fall behind the aircraft. The first officer called out positive rate, which prompted the captain to ask for the gear to be retracted. So now this really light aircraft was climbing with full thrust and with significantly lower drag than it had during the last go-around. The captain also likely kept one hand on the thrust levers as he went around, which he shouldn't have. Once the go-around thrust is set, you should remove your hands and put both on the yoke. And in case he did so, with only his left hand available to manually deal with a huge pitch-up momentum from the engines, he now pushed forward even more than what was required, meaning that he never really reached the minimum 15 degrees pitch up that the head-up display was instructing him to do. It is also very possible that the flight director was now showing him a very high commanded pitch, much higher than normal due to the high thrust and the low drag, something that could have caused him to distrust the head-up display, further making the situation confusing for him. Meanwhile, the first officer was contacting the tower, informing them of the go-around, again way too early given what was happening in the left-hand seat. The tower controller told him to contact the Rostov radar controller, but that call never happened. The captain was now pushing forward with a force of almost 23 kilos to keep the nose of the aircraft low, even though, like I mentioned before, the attitude should have actually been increased a bit further. Now, trying to fly an aircraft that is so out of trim is quite complicated and increases the workload significantly. And that's on a pilot who was now likely really confused about which profile he was actually following and if he could even trust his instruments. We know that he was mentally behind at this point based on his recorded control wheel inputs, who were much longer and more abrupt than normal with significant delays between them. He changed pitch several times, but he never really followed the head-up display commands, and the average pitch during the initial part of this go-around remained around 10 degrees, far less than what was needed. And this meant that the aircraft was now starting to accelerate fast. Meanwhile, the first officer was not suffering from any mental blockages at this point, and he saw that the pitch was too low. He called for the captain to keep it to 15 degrees, nose up. And as a response to that, the captain momentarily actually pitched up to 18.5 degrees, but then almost immediately pitched forward again to 5 degrees with a huge movement of the yoke. Now, if you pitch to 18 degrees and then immediately down to 5 degrees again, it will come with some very real consequences in the aircraft. Namely, you will create near weightlessness. This sudden reduction to 0.43 G was followed by a slight momentarily reduction of thrust. And this is how we know that the captain still had his hand on the thrust levers, because this was not a voluntary movement, but likely instead a reaction to being lifted in his seat. The first officer kept calling out instructions to the captain on how to maintain his pitch, but as he did so, none of the pilots were monitoring the speed, which had now reached over 200 knots and was still increasing. This led to a flap blowback from 15 to 10 degrees in a very similar way to what had happened in the previous go-around, but this time the situation was not getting better. At time 04, 41 and 30 seconds, that's 40 seconds into this go-around, the aircraft started entering into its final, really critical state. Now, some of you might have noticed that I haven't mentioned somatogravic illusion yet, and there's a reason for that. Somatogravic illusion is what happens when the balance organs in our inner ears cannot distinguish between, for example, an acceleration and a pitch up. If we lack visual cues, the inner ear will assume that what we're feeling has all to do with pitch and will therefore sum together any accelerations and pitch up, leading to a feeling of a much larger movement. A lot of people